Good morning. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to this session this morning, the second day of the 4th South Asian Speakers Summit on Achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Today's session is on climate change, the adverse effects of climate change, and how we can adapt and mitigate to this situation. We have three distinguished panel discussants this morning with us. Let me just give you a very brief introduction about the distinguished panelists. Of course, we have with us the Honorable Speaker of the People's Majlis of Maldives, His Excellency Mohammad Nasheed with us. The panel discussant, the first speaker will be Mr. Arniko Kumar Pandey. He's a very well-known atmospheric scientist from Nepal whose research focuses on atmospheric chemistry and physics in mountain areas. He was not able to be here with us, but are grateful that he has agreed to participate, and we will connect with him. The second speaker is Mr. Charles Chauvels, who is a member of the who used to be a member of the New Zealand Parliament for 7 years and held a number of important functions at various organizations, including the New Zealand AIDS Foundation. As of 2013, he contributes to the work of UNDP, where he currently is the global lead of the program on inclusive processes and institutions at the Bangkok Regional Hub. The third speaker is Honorable Ahmed Salim. He's the chair of the Environment and Climate Change Committee of the People's Majlis. Welcome all the panel discussants this morning who are experts, and they will share their expertise and knowledge with us on this topic of climate change. I would like to thank you all for being here with us this morning. Each speaker will have about 10 to 15 minutes to make their presentation, and then we will also have interactive session. It is my pleasure now to invite Mr. Arniko Kumar Pandey, and I believe he will be connected with us.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me, and I apologize for not making it in person. It's my pleasure to be able to give you a broad overview of climate change and also its interlinkages with air pollution and health in South Asia. I'll wait for my presentation to be put up on screen and for me to be able to see that, and then I'll start the presentation. Is it possible to have maybe page one, the starting page? So it's my pleasure to be here also on behalf of ICIMOD, the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, where I work, which is a 8-country intergovernmental organization based in Kathmandu, Nepal, which is the city you see in the picture there. We're in the laps of the Himalaya. And while our focus is on the mountain areas, of course, our interest and our concern about climate change extends all the way to Maldives and to the Indian Ocean. Could we have the next page, please? Page 2, please. Mm-hmm. Maybe have page 2 up on screen. Yes, so we'll start on the northern side of South Asia in the Hindu Kush Himalaya mountain region, which is, you see, shaded in darker brown. Outside of the polar regions, the Arctic and Antarctica, this is the largest storage of frozen water. Next, please. but the Himalaya are changing rapidly. So on page 3, you see the picture of, can we have page 3 on screen, please? Thank you. You see the exact same location taken in 1921 and 2008, and you see just how much of the snow and ice has already melted away in the Himalayas. This is near the north side of Mount Everest. Next. And in the Himalaya, we have a lot of communities that depend on glaciers and on snowmelt, and they're already feeling the impact, especially in the dry season, of having less water available. Next. Next. Yes, thank you. Global temperatures have been increasing throughout the world. Here you see the record from 1880 through 2020, or through almost 2020. And actually, July 2019 has been the warmest month on Earth on record. Next. The biggest driver of global climate change is carbon dioxide, CO2, which is at the highest level now for the past 800,000 years. What you see in the graph is the CO2 concentrations captured in air bubbles that were trapped in ice cores. Next. And in fact, in Greenland and Antarctica, this summer has been the time with faster melting ever. And you see here a satellite image of the same glacier in Greenland. On the left side, the left half of the picture was taken in 1972, on the right side this year. And you see just how much of the ice has already disappeared. Next. Melting of the ice on land contributes to rising sea levels. If all the ice in Greenland and Antarctica and the Himalaya were to melt, it would raise sea levels by almost 80 meters. And unfortunately, that is extremely alarming for the Maldives, but also for all the coastal areas with very large cities, with large populations, with large areas of grain production. We're talking about an emergency situation here. And while we don't foresee to see 80-meter rise within our lifetime, we still will be seeing a rise in sea levels that will cause a lot of damage and a lot of problems. If we go back to the Himalaya, the melting of the Himalayas has been caused by greenhouse gas-induced global warming, but also by other factors. Black carbon, which is the soot particle that darkens snow and ice, can deposit on it, darken the snow and ice and melt it, and also warm the air in contact with snow and ice surfaces. Next. In fact, let me just briefly tell you about black carbon, which is the black smoke that you see coming out of diesel trucks or brick kilns. It's a carcinogen, has an impact on health, it reduces visibility, has an impact on climate by warming the air, and is the second biggest factor after CO2 affecting climate. And South Asia is one of the biggest source regions of it. Black carbon is considered a short-lived climate pollutant, SLCP, and I'll get back to those in a moment. Next. But air pollutants also affect the climate in other ways. The monsoon is affected by air pollutants, as well as by greenhouse gas warming. Next. And once you start messing with the monsoon system, of course, in South Asia, we have a major impact both on food security, but also on disaster risk as we change when and how much rainfall falls where. Next. Some of the air pollution sources are up near the high mountains and have direct impacts on climates. For example, these forest fires in the picture here from Nepal. Next. And lower down, the hills below the mountains are very densely populated. Here you see the Annapurna Himalaya, and below the city of Pokhara hidden in a hazy layer. Next. And it's many of our practices that are actually quite avoidable, but that contribute to a large part of the problem. For example, here, burning garbage on the street, right in a place where, right at breathing height, where the smoke goes right into people's lungs. Next. And lighting fires in the evening when the smoke spreads horizontally and doesn't, and again goes straight into homes. Next. In South Asia, about half of the black carbon emissions are from cooking with firewood, with biofuels. Next. And the cooking with biofuels, of course, leads to a major indoor air pollution problem, with very poor ventilation, especially in situations like in the picture on the right, leading to indoor air pollution levels that are much, much worse than what is faced outdoors most of the time, leading to several million deaths a year from air pollution, according to WHO figures. Next, please. But the pollution can spread across the broader region. You see two pictures of Kathmandu taken from a mountaintop 2 days apart. Nothing changed with emissions within the valley, but what changed was whether the regional air pollution, the regional haze, had arrived or not. Next. South of Kathmandu, south of the hills, south of Kathmandu, over the Indo-Gangetic Plains, there is often in the dry season, there is a very polluted air covering a large region that penetrates up into the mountains. Next. You see here a plume coming into the Kathmandu Valley. Next, if we step back a bit and look at a satellite view, you see the haze from the plains merging into the mountain valleys. Next, and all the way up to the high mountain areas. Next. In fact, sometimes parts of the Indo-Gangetic Plains are covered with such thick haze that the ground is no longer visible from space. Next. And you have a situation, for example, at the India-Pakistan border region, where there's 2 Punjab provinces, but it's one atmosphere that is really one dirty atmosphere that is shared between the two. Next. Also related to climate change, we've seen a major increase in fog across North and South Asia. This is driven partly by air pollution and partly by other changes. Next. And so we have pollution sources that are there's multiple sources. They emit both CO2 as well as air pollutants. They operate on a wide range of scales. Next. But really impact also people's health. And you see here a filter before and after air was pulled through it for 24 hours. This is in Kathmandu, the 261st most polluted city in the world. There are many more polluted cities. And this is what we're breathing. And South Asia has some of the most polluted cities in the world. Next slide. And then skip to the next also. Next. In fact, across North and South Asia, out of 51 cities, only one met the WHO average, as WHO guidelines for clean air. And about a dozen cities were more than 10 times above WHO guidelines. Next. That picture actually came out of the Hindu Kush Himalaya assessment, which is an assessment report that we have produced, we led from ECMOD, with more than 300 people involved over several years. It was released this year, and it gives the latest assessment from the science about what is happening in high mountain areas. Next. One of the key messages is that even 1.5 degrees is too hot for the Himalaya, that because of additional warming at high elevations, we'd expect to see much higher temperature increases. Next. In fact, even if we were to maintain a 1.5 degree world, the Himalayan glaciers would still disappear by about 1/3 of their volume. If current emission trends were kept, it would be by 2/3 of their volume. Next. The IPCC 1.5 degree report also highlights really that the world needs to act now to avoid the type of climate catastrophe that would happen if global temperatures exceeded 1.5 degrees. Next. In fact, it also points out that addressing climate change and keeping the temperature target to 1.5 degrees requires more than just addressing carbon dioxide, but also reducing the air pollutants that affect climate, the short-lived climate pollutants. We need integrated action on both. Next. Also recently released was a Asia Regional Assessment, the Science-Based Solutions Report, that focused on identifying the 25 most promising measures to reduce air pollution and mitigate climate in Asia. And this is freely available to download, and I can also send you the link. If you go to the next picture, it shows that it is possible with the clean air measures to reduce the number of people exposed to dirty air significantly. Even with current legislation, the number will go down somewhat, but then by also bringing in new measures that focus on everything from forest fires to brick kilns to agricultural burning, you can really clean up air in Asian cities. Next. In fact, the 3 recent assessment reports really provide a coherent narrative to us that addressing climate change is extremely important and urgent and needs to be done with very quick action. And at the same time, it also needs addressing air pollutants. That the high mountain areas are more vulnerable and we have very bad air quality in the cities, but that the ways to address them are fairly straightforward using existing technologies, but also addressing specific sources in South Asia that are a big source of air pollution. Next. In fact, when we think about air pollution and climate, we need to think about it as one atmosphere, an integrated atmosphere across South Asia, where we have borders where often it's difficult for people to cross. Air is the substance that travels back and forth. It goes in and out of countries, in and out of people's lungs, in and out of homes. And the impacts and the solutions of climate change and air pollution are both interconnected, and so are the solutions. Next. And what is really important is for us to cooperate across the region, to take into account the complex science, to do evidence-based policy making, taking a regional perspective. This requires collaboration among scientists, but also among policymakers, among legislators, among all of you, honorable audience. It requires integrated solutions that address air pollution, climate change, and SDGs. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you, to give a broad overview, and I'll be happy to attend remotely through the discussion. Thank you so much. I will put my mic on mute now, but I will be happy to join in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pandey. Thank you very much for joining us and for a very informative overview on the impacts of climate change. Mr. Pandey has very eloquently discussed how the Himalayan glaciers are melting and leading to higher river flow, and how these changes are affecting us in many different ways. He has also talked about air pollution and highlighted the necessity to deal with the impacts of climate change. Quick action is needed to be taken, and evidence-based policy making is an important aspect which he has pointed out. So thank you, Mr. Pandey, for a very instructive overview. Now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Chauvel, who will focus his presentation on practical suggestions for increased parliamentary action in catalyzing the climate agenda. Mr. Chauvel, you now have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Honourable presiding officers and deputies, honourable members of Parliament, Secretary-General of the Interparliamentary Union, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Charles Chauvel. I work for the United Nations Development Programme. UNDP is the biggest supporter worldwide of parliamentary strengthening work, and we're very happy that we partner with the Interparliamentary Union in many ways in implementing this important part of the governance program that UNDP is engaged with. The reason UNDP, a development organisation, is so concerned with promoting good governance, and in particular good, strong parliaments, is typified by the Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular Sustainable Development Goal 16. That goal calls for effective, inclusive, accountable institutions of government to deliver the rest of the 2030 agenda. And obviously, the accountability aspect of those institutions must be to you as Parliament and parliamentarians. You hold the elected mandate on behalf of the people to require those institutions to deliver the right mix and quality of services to ensure that all of the Sustainable Development Goals are met. Now, in her introduction, Madam Speaker Chowdhury mentioned that I'd been a Member of Parliament in New Zealand for some 7 years. In my time as an MP, I chaired the Public Accounts Committee in New Zealand. I was also the Shadow Minister for Climate and Environment, and in that capacity I attended the UN conferences of the parties on climate change in Copenhagen in 2009 and in Mexico and Cancun in 2010. So I do have a real interest in looking at ways in which parliaments can address the climate emergency that Mr. Pandey's just so eloquently described. But also, I think there's an area where parliaments have been ignored, and where I think parliaments have an opportunity to assert themselves. And that's really what I want to speak to in the next 10 minutes or so in this presentation. It's the issue of financing the SDGs in general, but climate change in particular, and the challenges that the new thinking around SDG financing actually presents for parliaments and parliamentarians. And I believe it's not really being well addressed, and I don't believe we have a lot of time to think about how we do address this issue effectively. Just to provide some context, you probably all know that in September 2015, heads of state and government met in New York to agree the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This new way of thinking, produced by the United Nations but guided by member states, that set out a roadmap for trying to eliminate extreme poverty and inequality, but within planetary limits, so not destroying the planet in the process of achieving human development by 2030. And I want to pay tribute to the Interparliamentary Union here, because very importantly in the 2030 declaration, the role of parliaments is actually explicitly addressed. And you probably know that this is quite unusual. In most international instruments, the executive branch of government is mentioned, parliaments are largely ignored. But the lawmaking function, the function for approving national budgets, and the function of oversight of government programs are all expressly mentioned as being essential to the achievement of the 2030 agenda. One area where I think parliaments have an important function, but where there was not a mention of the role in this declaration, was leaving no one behind, making sure that national and subnational policies and programs reach those first most at risk of being left behind. And you know, I think anyone who's sat in a parliament knows that the representation function really goes to the heart of making sure that the most vulnerable, the most marginalised, the most at risk in your constituents, in your constituencies, that this role of ensuring their welfare is looked after. This is not well represented in the 2030 agenda, and I want to talk about the consequence of that omission shortly. I think there's also another issue in the whole area of climate financing that parliaments need to be aware of, and that is that although when the 2030 declaration was agreed in 2015 and when the Addis Ababa Action Plan on Climate Financing was agreed in the same year, parliamentary role was addressed. But when we come to the key document on climate agreed in the same year, the Paris Agreement, there's really no mention of the role of parliaments at all. Let's consider why this matters. What I've done here is put up a grid that conceptualises my organisation's thinking on climate financing and SDG financing. How is it that we raise the extra $1.4 trillion every year between now and 2030 that's required to meet the 2030 agenda, including the climate emergency? And if you have a look at the graph, it goes from quite pure public finance thinking right up at the top, integrated financing frameworks for SDGs, round to budgeting, obviously a really important issue for parliaments, looking at SDG-related debt and fiscal instruments, ensuring that there isn't tax leakage, for example, in the revenue requirements for the SDGs and for climate financing, leveraging international public finance for the SDGs. There's a whole range of new finance facilities available to member states of the UN to meet the challenges of the SDGs and of climate change. And how should these be leveraged to be included in the national effort to develop and to do so sustainably? And then the graph goes around further, and as it gets deeper in the blue, it deals more with the private sector's role in climate financing. Now, I was going to go through each of these in some detail, but I think I don't need to for the purposes of this presentation. I think the point really is this. In the Paris Agreement on climate change in 2015, you've got these instruments called nationally determined contributions. These are the documents that the nations that signed up to the Paris Agreement are required to deposit with the Secretariat of the Convention, detailing how they're going to, in domestic terms, meet the challenges of getting to below 2 degrees in a rise in temperature over the requisite period. And you heard from Mr. Pando that even that might not be enough to meet the emergency. Now, obviously, you all know that the United States, under the current administration, has announced an intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement and not to honour its requirements. This, I think, fortunately, has not been a contagious announcement so far. But as with the rest of the 2030 agenda, the scale of the investment required to meet the nationally determined contributions goes well beyond the capacities of public domestic finance, private sector finance, and international public climate finance are also required. And what I've done here, just to give you an idea of how much international activity is going on in this area, is just listed some of these new sources for your own member states and their governments of climate finance. These are all the different new funds that can be accessed now and are being accessed by your governments to meet the climate emergency. There's the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, the Climate Investment Funds, the Global Environment Facility Trust Fund, the GEF, the International Climate Fund of the UK, the International Climate Initiative of Germany, the Least Developed Countries Fund, the Nordic Climate Fund, and the UN RED program. All these new billion-dollar funds dispersing money to countries to meet climate change problems. So what does this mean for parliaments and parliamentarians? You know, when I was an MP, chair of the Public Accounts Committee in New Zealand, my job was really easy. We were looking at whether or not taxation was being authorised by Parliament, as it was required to be, whether borrowing by government was properly authorised by Parliament as it was required to be, and whether spending in the budget was first of all authorised by an appropriation, and secondly whether the spending actually occurred in a manner consistent with the appropriation that was presented to Parliament. Simple, very, very simple. Then during my time as an MP, people started thinking about international treaties. These had always been the preserve of the executive branch of government. Parliament didn't really have a role in concerning itself with treaties, and a provision was introduced in New Zealand at the same time as in many other parliaments to give Parliament a responsibility to approve the ratification of treaties, a big new responsibility for Parliament. So the role was starting to get more complex. But if you have a look at the challenges and the complexities that are put in place by these new instruments, ask yourselves these questions. For example, does your government operate any sort of climate change expenditure tracking system, given that all the revenues that I've just described at the international level can go to lots of different ministries inside the government? Is there any sort of marker or tag that allows you as parliamentarians in the Finance Committee or in various committees of Parliament to consider what the sources of climate financing are and where they're coming from and how they're being spent? Also, if you think about state revenue coming from these vertical funds and from blended finance opportunities, for example, the Gates Foundation, the great philanthropic funds from the private sector that are also offering money to governments and NGOs to operate inside your countries. Are these revenues on book? Are these available for your scrutiny in the same way as tax revenues or other sources of revenues for ministries or for other expenditures occurring domestically? Or are they completely beyond the purview of Parliament in considering how they're spent, where they come from, what they're doing? Does adequate oversight exist of the interplay between declared public expenditure priorities on the part of your government and the priorities of international organisations spending money inside your country, international non-government organisations, private sector entities, philanthropies, all programming inside your jurisdictions? Is there somebody inside the government who's responsible for coordinating all of this? And if there isn't, does Parliament have a role here to at least ask the question of government, hey, who's the coordinator here? Who's making sure that all these different types of financial instruments, rather than creating chaos and working against each other, are actually part of a holistic and coordinated approach to the climate challenge at the national and subnational levels? As I say, the picture is made much more complex by the existence of these vertical funds, which are important and vital parts of the international effort to meet the climate emergency. National governments have largely adapted to the challenge of dealing with them because they are their recipients. But largely, in my view, parliaments have been absent from much of the thinking around how the spending that occurs from the vertical funds and from the private sector and from philanthropies, from NGOs, even international organisations, how this coordination occurs and how oversight should occur. I think there's also an issue that's important around the issue of the NCD document itself. This is, as I said before, the document that the government presents to the Climate Secretariat, and it says, this is how we're going to meet the Paris targets in our country. Well, how many of these NCDs in your countries are laid before Parliament for scrutiny or approval? How many parliamentary processes, nationally or subnationally, occur in terms of being consulted about the content of an NCD? Does the Ministry of the Environment or the Finance Ministry have to come before the relevant control committee of the Parliament and either get approval or at least engage in some consultation on the content of the NCD. Is there a debate in your plenary on the content of the NCD once it's been lodged with the Secretariat? Or is Parliament again effectively sidestepped here in this process, even where you have a constitutional legal requirement that a treaty be approved or ratified by the Parliament? Because you see, an NCD isn't a treaty. It's an international instrument of wide-ranging effect, but it doesn't have conventional status. And one last point on the challenges for parliaments. Often these vertical funds will have as their counterparty the Ministry of Finance or the Ministry for the Environment. And they'll disperse funds nationally to very important projects, coastal protection, adaptation measures, how to keep villages and towns in the Himalayas on the right track on climate mitigation and adaptation, how to deal with many of the problems that Mr. Pandey illuminated in his address. There are very few examples of parliaments being involved in the bidding for funds for climate emergency. So, for example, capacitating the Parliamentary Environment Committee, ensuring that the Parliamentary Finance Committee is exercising proper control over expenditure. These are very important aspects of ensuring that the climate emergency is addressed in terms and in accord with the will of the people. But largely, ministries and the vertical funds, I think, are sidestepping Parliament, and I think parliaments should assert themselves with national authorities and say, listen, when you're bidding for vertical fund support, don't forget that parliaments play an important role in oversight, in supervision, in lawmaking and in representation. And you should be including the relevant parliamentary committees in the structure of your proposals so that they are also funded for capacitation and oversight of the disbursement of these funds, and that they are also up to the moment with what is being done in these areas. So I don't want to labour these points any longer. I think we have another 11 years between now and the end of the 2030 agenda. Donors have been traditionally retreating from supporting parliaments, and I think this is an area where we should be quite alert to the challenges of off-book expenditure and the need for proper oversight, proper national ownership of the NCDs, and a proper involvement of Parliament and parliamentarians in meeting the climate emergency. It's great to be briefed on the problems, as we were with the previous presentation. It's actually also vital that parliaments and parliamentarians assert their rights and duties on oversight in particular to ensure that the climate emergency is being met in a constitutionally appropriate way when public spending is concerned. So just to close on a couple of knowledge products and resources that we've been working on in this area. I think IPU have already mentioned our self-assessment toolkit that we worked on UNDP at IPU. There's some very good basic work in here, and if your parliament hasn't yet engaged on the self-assessment toolkit to produce a bit of a diagnostic on where your parliament is at in terms of being fit for purpose on SDG financing and oversight, I would absolutely recommend that you talk to UNDP and IPU, and we'll absolutely happily come and facilitate a workshop for you if you'd find it useful. In the region, we're also doing some work under some of our programs. This is a climate financing handbook that we produced for the federal, provincial and local assemblies in Nepal, which makes a lot of the points that I tried to make in my presentation and talks about some of the solutions. Similarly, a climate budget review guide for the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa Assembly in Pakistan, and one that we're working on with the National Assembly in Pakistan. These are the types of work that we're very happy to do with your parliaments according to your own specific requirements and constitutional positions, in order to make sure that members of parliament, committees, the plenary are not sidestepped but are actually brought in as part of an integral element of the urgent need to address SDG financing and the climate emergency. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Chauvel, for your very interesting presentation. Mr. Chauvel has shared with us the theme of how parliaments can be central in its role and can play an instrumental role in mitigating and adapting the effects and adverse effects of climate change. Throughout his presentation, he has stressed on the role of parliaments, the monitoring, representative and oversight role. He has focused on the financing of SDG and particularly the financing of climate, and he has also mentioned a couple of new funds which are now disbursing funds for countries to deal with the impact of climate change. He has touched upon the Paris Agreement and how the parliaments are not so much central in this discourse, but highlighted the importance of the role of the parliamentarians and how they can track the tax and revenue money in their own respective countries that is being spent on account of climate change. What are the different mechanisms that can be devised by parliamentarians to scrutinize this budget spending? These were the salient features which have been highlighted very eloquently by Mr. Chauvel. Thank you, Mr. Chauvel, for your very interesting presentation. It is my pleasure now to invite Mr. Salim, the Honourable Member of Parliament of the People's Majlis of Maldives, to provide us with a national perspective on the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Honourable Salim, you have the floor now.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. A very good morning to all of you. It's a great honor and a privilege for me to be here and speak a few words on this very important subject. In fact, environment and climate change per se as a thematic area is relatively new in the Maldives Parliament, although as a subject this has been discussed in various committees, in various agenda items, but this is the first time the Maldives Parliament recognizes climate change and environment as a theme that requires a specific focus and attention. So I'm very pleased to be in the 19th Parliament as a member, in which I am the speaker I'm the chair of the committee. To put the subject into a context, I want to highlight a few points. Some of it may not be very new to you, but we have been talking about the importance of climate change, not only for the Maldives, for the region as well. But I think Maldives is a special case. Because it is perhaps one of the most vulnerable countries, not only in the region, but globally as well. It is a very, very small country, but It could also be argued that it is a large maritime state. We may be the smallest in terms of land area and in terms of population size, but of course, we have a long history, a very rich culture. We're talking about 3,000 years of culture and way of life here in these beautiful islands. But the issue is that we are among the most environmentally vulnerable on the earth, with just 1 meter above the mean sea level. We have been observing very fast changes in climatic patterns in the Maldives. In the north, we have observed increasing trends in the rainfall, while in the south, we have low intensity rainfall in the Maldives. Locally, we have been observing the sea level has been rising at a rate of 3 millimeters every year. We're talking about a country which is just 1 meter above the mean sea level. So even 1 millimeter increase means a significant change for us. And now the observation has been that the sea level has been rising at a rate of 3 millimeters per year. Sea surges has becoming a very serious problem for the Maldives because you know how close our vital infrastructures are to the coastline. And vector-borne diseases are on the rise, new pathogens, new pests are increasing, and associated deaths are also rising. Freshwater resources in the Maldives are very, very limited. Only limited thin layer of groundwater is the only reliable source of water in the Maldives. And in the islands, you would see rainwater till very recently has been the main source of drinking water for us. And our GDP is very, very narrow. 90% of our GDP is dependent on the marine biological diversity. And the situation shows no sign of improvement despite all the dialogues, despite all the agreements and commitments and political discourse. You see no sign of improvement. I just happened to see the very latest report by the American Meteorological Society with contribution from 475 scientists from 57 countries, which was released only quite recently. It says 2018 was the 4th warmest year on record. Last year happened to be the 4th warmest on record. Sea level rose to a record level for a 7th consecutive year. And glaciers continue to melt at a concerning rate for the 30th straight year. Now, these are very, very alarming statements for the Maldives, and it is not very difficult to understand if I said sea level rise represents an existential threat to the Maldives, with future sea level projected to increase in the range of 10 to 100 centimeters by 2100, the entire country would be submerged. But the problem is, we're talking of a country which is 1 meter above the sea level, and yet our contribution to the climate change problem has been very, very small. Our emission, looking at the data, most recent data, our emission is almost insignificant. We are talking about 1 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent in 2015. This is a very, very small amount. But you see, business as usual scenario, a 2 degrees Celsius target would have been missed if we continue the business as usual scenario. And the worst case scenario, our contribution would have been 3.3 million tons of CO2 equivalent by 2030, by 2030. And if the world was not serious enough by then, the 2-degree opportunity would have been missed, and the situation would have been very scary for the Maldives. Let us recall the events of 1997 and 1998, in which the entire capital city, this island, was flooded by sea inundation due to sea surges. Japanese government came to our rescue, and they protected Male by building a wall which has a length of 1,266 meters. And you know the price. The price was $8,768 per meter, and we are talking of protecting 1,200 or 1,300 islands. At this cost, it would be impossible for us to protect all our islands and continue the way of life that we enjoy today. So what we are trying to say is that adaptation per se is not the solution that we are seeking for. We want the whole world to be very serious and to focus on cutting down global emissions as the most important way of saving the world from the catastrophic impacts of climate change. But the problem has been the world is still not very serious about the issue. With the nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement, the scientists say between 3 degrees to 3.3 degrees Celsius temperature rise will be very likely if we do not cut significant amounts of CO2 emissions within the next 10 to 11 years. If you look at the statistics, it says in 2016, the world invested some $295 billion in renewable energy, and additional $150 billion on renewable energy subsidies, while $742 billion was invested fossil fuel, and $373 spent on oil subsidies. Now we need to be more serious, focusing on the urgency of increasing ambition and implementation at all levels of government, business, and civil society. Our region as a whole need to act, and we should call together to reduce emission by 45% and achieve net zero by 2050. And even we should be bold enough to take economic actions against those countries that fail to be serious. And as governments, as policymakers, as lawmakers, we should not be supporting projects and programs that actually favors fossil fuel-based projects, while we see very clearly there are opportunities and options available for us to invest for renewable energy. And that is what, as parliamentarians, we should be most focusing on. Looking at the challenges as parliamentarians to address the issue of climate change, we know that most countries in the region lack a strong institutional and legal framework to govern climate change, and adaptation and mitigation measures are not currently legally binding on the government due to absence of specialized climate change regime. This is the case for the Maldives as well, and although a number of legislation and regulations indirectly confer powers on the government institutions to take mitigation measures against climate change. Our Constitution of 2008 does not contain specific provisions to address climate change, although Article 22 lays down a duty on the state to protect and preserve natural environment and undertake and promote desirable economic and social goals through ecologically balanced and sustainable manner. Article 93B of our constitution states that although Maldives has ratified a convention in accordance with constitutional provisions, the citizens are only required to act in compliance with such conventions or treaties as provided for through a law enacted by the Parliament. What I'm trying to say is a specific law would be required, enacted by the Parliament for people to be able to then abide by it. I highlighted these points because, as we heard previously, the Paris Agreement provides only a very limited guidance to national law and policymakers, in contrast to many other international multilateral agreements and conventions. The Paris Agreement does not specify how parties are to implement their NDCs or the nationally determined contributions. And in practice, countries will have to rely on domestic policy, domestic law, and regulations for it to be able to make meaningful achievements. The NDC in the Maldives builds on existing climate change and development strategies and policies, but it is not backed by legislation. There is the need to legislate for Paris Agreement and to enact Maldives targets under the agreement. The act would cover aspects such as establishing national coordination mechanism for its implementation, greenhouse emission reduction targets under nationally determined contributions, as well as adaptation goals and minimizing loss and damage. But honorable speakers and distinguished guests, I don't think as responsible people to even think that lack of legal instruments could be considered even a reason to do the right thing and to take right actions in fighting against climate change, when the science is so clear, when facts are so straight, and when the knowledge is so widely available. Therefore, we in the Maldives, in the Parliament, would not be waiting and sitting and expecting the legal drafts to reach to us for us to be able to take action. In the 19th Parliament, as well as in the Climate Change Committee, we are doing everything that we could to make the climate change and environment as one of the most important areas in the Parliament agenda. And in doing that, we will be making sure that we do not spend unnecessarily on dirty technologies, on fossil fuel-based energy generation, whereas the economics is very clear for us, especially in the case of the Maldives, that investing in fossil fuel and subsidizing on fossil fuel-based electricity makes no sense to us at all. Whereas we will be working with the government and other institutions in the country to change our focus and directions towards investing in renewable energy, and we believe that is the only way, and that is the only way that we can sustain ourselves, and that is the only way that we can achieve meaningful sustainable development. I will be very happy to contribute in the discussion, and thank you very much for your attention, and thank you very much for this opportunity as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Ahmed Salim, Chair of the Environment and Climate Change Committee, People's Majlis of Maldives, for your excellent presentation, giving us a clear picture about the Maldives scenario and how it will be affected by climate change. Even 1 millimeter change of the sea level will have great impacts, negative impacts, and it is reported that 3 millimeter rise every year of sea level is being noticed. The marine biological diversity contributes 90% to the GDP of Maldives. That will also be under threat if we cannot take action in time. Thank you very much for your presentation, highlighting that it is very important for all of us to take very seriously the agenda of cutting down global emission, as that can help us at this time, and how we can encourage the use of renewable energy and reduce emission up to 45%. So, Honorable Ahmed Salim has flagged a few very important aspects with which parliamentarians can work on and take the climate agenda forward. I express my thanks to all the three panel discussants for the excellent presentations this morning. Now we will move on to interactive session, and the floor is now open for discussion. I will invite Honorable MP from Pakistan, Riaz Fatehana, for comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Shirin Sharmeen Chaudhary, Speaker of Bangladesh Parliament. First of all, this is my prayer and honor to announce that National Assembly of Pakistan and Inter-Parliamentary Union both are going to organize a regional parliamentary conference on sustainable development goals on 2nd and 3rd March 2020 at Islamabad, Pakistan. And UNDP and UNICEF will also be in collaboration. So I, on behalf of Pakistan Parliament, I invite all regional parliaments to become part of that. Secondly, I'm also grateful to Mr. Martin, my old friend, who is Secretary General IPU, who agreed on this issue. Ladies and gentlemen, here I would add few more things in this session because I know time is very short. So Pakistan ratified the Paris Agreement on 10th of November 2016, on the same year when Paris Agreement was adopted. And everybody knows that Sustainable Development Goals number 11, 12, 13, and 14, and 15 are directly linked with SDGs. Due to increase in climate crisis, humanity is suffering at an alarming rate. Our right to life, health, food, water, housing, and livelihood all is at stake. Climate change is a non-traditional threat to Pakistan. Pakistan has been declared among the top 10 countries most affected by climate change. Due to global warming, extreme change in the weather conditions are leading to natural disasters like badly floods, cyclones, and drought affecting our daily lives badly. In addition to melting of glaciers, reducing rainfall in other parts of the country, high temperature is damaging our infrastructure as well as our agricultural patterns. These hazards, when combined with vulnerability like poverty, poor health conditions, weak disaster management, puts people at further stake. Ladies and gentlemen and distinguished guests, air pollution in urban areas is an serious problem, which is main cause for stunting in small children because they have small lungs and they take more air from the atmosphere. Secondly, black carbon coming out from bricks kilns is a big issue in my country. We are trying to overcome. Smoke is in start of winter is another emerging problem. Mostly smoke come to us from East Punjab to West Punjab, so which earlier Mr. Bande told. In legislation, Pakistan adopted Pakistan Environment Protection Act 2017, and we have 4 provinces. All provinces like Punjab, Sindh, Balochistan, and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa also adopted and passed an Environment Act in 2017. Furthermore, we have invited various projects which are on line with the Paris Agreement. We have launched the Billion Tree Project. When our new government took charge in last year, our Prime Minister, Mr. Imran Khan, announced this project, and now we are working on to install, to put 10 billion trees all over the country in next 4 years. Clean and green Pakistan is our main agenda. Improvement of Central Karakoram National Park is on way. Dear follows, lastly, I would like to say social, environmental and economic impacts caused by climate change are of great concern in developing countries. Like Pakistan, collaborations are key to build strategic climate resilience and to be successful in long term. We need to extend to regional partnership between countries. We are not alone in this. We need to join hands and act as a force against this fatal change. In the end, I urge all regional parliaments to start from today. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you, Honorable MP from Pakistan, for your comments. Yes, India.
Chairperson Dr. Sirin Sarmin Chaudhary, Bangladesh Speaker, His Excellency Honorable Speaker Male, Mr. Nasheer Sahab, and distinguished delegates. We all are aware of the effects of global climate change on the environment. Needless to say, the glaciers are shrinking, ice covers of the rivers and lakes are breaking up, plant and animal ranges are shifting, and flowers are blooming sooner. Scientific predictions on global climate change are now turning into realities. The effects of climate change on each one of us are now evident from the events such as rising sea level, which was mentioned here, loss of sea ice and glaciers, longer intense heat waves and torrential rains causing floods and landslides. The situation warrants immediate human intervention in a coordinated manner to take corrective global action to stop further degradation of environment and casualty to human lives. Distinguished delegates, along with the other developing countries, India too faces major threats due to climate change. Owing to its diverse geography and a population of 1.3 billion, India is already battling with the challenges of poverty, eradication, and sustainable development, and limited natural resources. Frequent and unpredictable occurrences of extreme weather conditions are further threatening the availability of resources, thereby hampering our sustainable development efforts. Although India's per capita greenhouse gas emissions were only 1.8 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2014, which were lower than many developed countries and China, we have been continuously taking ambitious climate actions with a view to further reducing the emission level. India's leadership in the field of climate change has been globally recognized, and Honorable Prime Minister of India, Sri Narendra Modi, has been bestowed with the United Nations Champion of the Earth Award 2018 for pioneering the iconic International Solar Alliance of the solar resource-rich countries and taking measures to eliminate single-use plastic in India by 2022. The Government of India has launched the National Action Plan on Climate Change way back in June 2008 to address the climate change issues, comprising 8 missions in such crucial areas as solar energy, energy efficiency, water agriculture, Himalayan ecosystem, which was mentioned by Mr. Pandey, sustainable habitat, green India, and strategic knowledge on climate change. Over the years, the results under these missions have been quite encouraging. 3 of these missions, namely solar energy, energy efficiency, and green India, are focused on mitigation to reduce climate change, while the rest ones are focused on adapting to life in the changing climate. These missions outline a number of steps to simultaneously advance India's developmental agenda and climate change-related objectives of adaptation and mitigation. Further, we have in place a mechanism in the form of Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change, which coordinates the National Action Plan for Assessment, Adaptation, and Mitigation while addressing the challenges of climate change and guides the government on proactive measures to deal with the emerging threats. It also facilitates interministerial coordination and guides policy formulation in the relevant areas, reinforcing India's commitment to the National Development Agenda and propelling the SDGs agenda forward. The Indian Parliament has taken exemplary initiative over the years and organized several forums to develop policy and action perspective on eliminating poverty, promoting gender equality, and addressing the climate change issues. Further, the departmentally related standing committees on science and technology, environment and forest of our parliament examines from time to time the demands for grant of the ministries dealing with climate change and related matters, thereby making the executive accountable to the parliament for any error or omission on the issue of implementation of the policies, programs related to climate change and the relevant international agreements. Mr. Saville, which he mentioned here, who mentioned about finance tracking for climate change, I'm happy to inform that we have a separate and one of the most active parliamentary committees. It not only examines the budget of the ministry with climate change, it also continuously monitors the efforts and suggests way and means to do everything possible to mitigate ill effects of climate change, both preventive and others. Distinguished delegates, under the Paris Agreement, India has submitted its nationally determined contribution NDC outlining 8 different targets for the period 2021-30. Two notable targets are, first, a reduction in the emission intensity of GDP by 33 to 35% by 2030 from 2005 level, and second, achieving about 40% cumulative electric power installed capacity from non-fossil fuels based energy resource by 2030. India has also committed to work towards creating an additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent through additional forest and tree cover by 2030. The other targets pertain to sustainable lifestyles, climate-friendly growth path, climate change adaptation, climate finances, technology and capacity building. We have prepared a detailed time-bound blueprint to address air pollution issues with a specific time, providing incentives to farmers and removing industries from cities, already providing incentives to electric vehicle owners. As you know, all country parties negotiated the Paris Agreement in good faith, capturing their diverse needs and priorities, especially that of the developing country parties, building on the fact that the developed and developing countries have different national circumstances, varying developmental priorities and different starting points while implementing the Paris Agreement. India has also emphasized the need to adhere to the principle of equity, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities and climate change. Last 2 points more, madam. I'll mention A.K. Pandey's presentation related to climate change, which was shown here in the beginning. It is simply brilliant and a kind of warning to all of us. Would like to mention his one remark: the atmosphere in South Asia is more integrated than probably any other entity. It's a clear that nature has linked to each other, so we all have to think and act collectively. His other important observation that around half of South Asia's black carbon is coming from cooking. It will be very relevant to share in this August House an unique scheme of India, Parliamentary Ujjwala scheme. Launched on 1st May 2016, Parliamentary Ujjwala Yojana, PMUI, aims to safeguard the health of women and children by providing them with a clean cooking fuel, LPG, so that they do not have to compromise their health in smoky kitchens or wander in unsafe areas collecting firewoods. As on 22/8/2019, 715 districts have been covered with.
I'm afraid you have to be
Just
brief.
one minute, I'll just finish.
Yes.
Almost 8 crore, I'll just mention, connected related to so far. The aim of the scheme is to provide universal coverage of cooking gas in the country. Last point, madam. In the context of delivering on the Paris Agreement, let me re-emphasize that one of the most crucial concerns for the developing countries, including the South Asia countries, is the provision of support from the developed countries in terms of adequate and predictable finance, technology transfer, and capacity building for overcoming their specific challenge in achieving the goals of this agreement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, India. We are actually running out of time as we have to move on to the next roundtable discussion of the speakers. So if there is any question, 1 minute for question only, no comments. Is there any question? Then I will also request the panel discussants to respond. If you wish to respond, you have 2 minutes to respond, or 1 minute, yes. Mr. Chauville.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Just very briefly, I think as parliamentarians, it's very important, as I said in my presentation, for lawmakers to be well capacitated on the substance of climate change and what can be done to address it. But as I pointed out in my presentation, I think there is a procedural aspect, a very important procedural aspect to the parliamentary role as the overseers of government activity, to ensure that we don't simply obsess about the substance of the response, but that we stand back and that we make sure that spending on the response, which is vast, is well coordinated, avoids corruption, is subject to all the ordinary checks and balances that public finance ought to be subject to, and that there is national ownership of the spending by virtue of the representation role and the mandate that you all have. And I don't want to look back in 11 years in 2030 at the end of the SDGs and find that because of a failure of oversight, the spending that needs to be directed to this emergency was not well coordinated and not well spent. And if we are in that position, it will be the responsibility in large part of parliaments and parliamentarians. So I do hope that we all can work together with the IPU, with UNDP, with all the support that's available to make sure that the controls and oversight that needs to be there are in place to meet this absolute unquestioned emergency, but to make sure that it is well met. Thank you.
I will now request Mr. Arniko Kumar Pandey to give his brief response. He's been here with us all along. Thank you, Mr. Pandey. Sorry, we are not being able to connect. So I would request Honorable Ahmed Salim for his response.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Not a response per se, but a final thought or comment to what honorable participants just expressed. Climate finance has been always an important issue. And as developing countries, as small island developing states, we would need a lot of finance to be able to adapt ourselves and also to undertake the necessary mitigation measures in the face of the increase in threats brought about by climate change. But one of the things that we have been observing over the past decade is that climate change platform has been seen as an avenue to get more and more finance as well, whereas our focus should have been more on cutting down emissions. Imagine the situation where, in the case of the Maldives, to protect our 1,100 islands, the amount of finance we would need. The amount of finance we would need to switch from fossil fuel-based energy generating system into a more cleaner technology. We would need a lot of finance. The problem has been that while we utilize the available financial resources for various projects, the main focus of mitigation and cutting down on greenhouse gases is not receiving the required attention and support. This is something we should not be forgetting. Now, this is the time that we focus on the right thing, which is cutting down on GHG emissions. Without doing that, I don't know what meaningful purpose we could achieve by only focusing on adaptation measures. We could continue to build walls around the islands, and what would be the meaning of that if you do not cut down on emissions? For how long can you go on adapting to a changing environment without actually addressing to the cause of the problem? That is the biggest problem that we have today. And also, a lot of money is lost to the corruption. A lot of climate finance is lost to the corruption. We are very pleased, very happy that we have a government in the Maldives that is founded, that is established on principles of good governance, transparency, zero tolerance to corruption, and we are very hopeful that the money that we get under climate financing will be utilized to meet the objectives, to meet the desired targets. And we have seen in the past 5 years, I don't want to politicize this issue, but looking at the facts, look at the past 5 years, the climate finance that was pledged to the Maldives did not arrive on time, partly because we did not have the social harmony and a stable democratic system in the Maldives. But fortunately, with the change in the government after a very successful election, that money that was on hold by various donors have started to reach to us, and we are very hopeful that more and more finance in the similar manner will come to us. But what I'm trying to say is that it's not only the finance that matters. We need commitment, we need political will, we need to learn to do the right thing, and that would be the most important for us. And we have very important conference coming up later this month, Climate Change Action Conference by the UN Secretary General, and I think the world leaders will be coming there. And I see that as a very good opportunity for us to renew our commitment and to set more ambitious targets, and to be willing to do something to save the world, and not forgetting that we have just about 10 years before we could do something meaningful to save the world and to save the Maldives as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would now like to request Right Honorable Speaker of Maldives, Mohammad Nasheed.
Thank you very much, and thank you all the interventions and all the speakers. All the points have been made, but I would like to point out a few things. One, the science is certain. It's happening, and we can all see that. And there's no point now going on and on about the science. We know that it is happening, and we know that the window of opportunity for us to find solutions is also getting closer, narrow and narrow and narrow. On the issue of how to finance, our view has been that we can now see climate issues, or rather renewable energy, for instance, more as an economic issue than a human rights or an ethical issue. Recently, in a bid, in a tender for a power plant in India, the renewable energy bid was actually cheaper than the coal bid. If you look at the Maldives, our production, electricity production, the cheapest is around 30 to 35 cents a unit, the cheapest. Now today you can have renewable energy at 15, 16, 17 cents in any given situation. So you may ask, why is the government of Maldives or the Maldives Electricity Board, or for that matter, the Sri Lankan Electricity Board or any other electricity board is not switching to renewables? We have found the answer to be is, I'll give you a very good example. The Maldives Electricity Board had recently spent another over $100 million on a diesel plant to be built in Hulumale and an electric grid network coming to Male. Now this is so expensive, the thing could actually have been built anywhere at $50 to $60 million. Now, because there is huge investments into these areas, the electricity board is now reluctant to switch to renewables, and therefore you can't pay back the huge big loan on diesel. Now, so we would always have this issue of investments in diesel and then a transitional period that goes into renewables. Another issue, I think, is on labor. People who are in the coal industry, in fuel industry, in diesel industry, especially the workers, they feel that if we change to renewables, they would lose their jobs. So they resist. Our point is that the transition to clean energy, in that transition, we must consider labor and those who are now working in the industry. On the COP conference, I feel that we should stop the COP for a while. We have met for 25, 26 years. I was there in 2009, and then again last year. I did mention then what seems to have happened is people have got married and they have children in the COP. So this is a happy, of course, a very happy situation, but it's not taking us to the direction that we want. Very sadly, industrialized and emerging countries are using debt as a leverage to discipline voting in COP. The Maldives and the small islands want the world temperatures to be maintained at 1.5 degrees. Now, we have a very happy situation where India is willing to do that. But we are again in a situation where, for instance, China is not willing to do that. And they are heavily lobbying small islands for these 2 degrees. So whenever we mention mitigation, they give us a little bit of money and then talk about adaptation. And we are therefore unable to focus on the real issue, which is climate change and which is mitigation. So I think emerging countries also, emerging developing countries, everyone must understand and should not use their clout in small islands to discipline voting methods in the conference of the parties. It's very sad that small islands are doing that. On infrastructure, we believe that we should be turning to more softer biological engineering. India has grown so much mangroves, shockingly so much that it can now protect vast areas of its coast. Building, I think Ahmad Salim pointed out, protecting 1 meter of coastline in the Maldives is easily $7,000. We are 2,000 islands. But if you implant a mangrove, if you let a reef grow, then you're doing the same thing again at a fraction of the cost. So if we can go into more sensible biological engineering, we feel that we are more likely to protect our shores than going into heavy concrete and heavy engineering. I would like to ask the World Bank and the IMF to stop funding these very, very heavy concrete infrastructure. Now, if you look at the islands in the Maldives, hopefully you will be able to see one of the inhabited islands today. We have sand migration around the island, and that keeps the island stable. The minute you come in and build a harbor, and stop sand migration, the island suddenly goes unstable, and then we have to heavily invest on the island to make it sustainable. Again, thank you very much. I am sure
could just have-
these issues will go
Mr.
into
Speaker, if
deliberation.
I could just
I was
take 10
just,
seconds.
I was
I'm
also just talking out of turn and took a
I
whole
know.
lot of time. We must end it now.
If I could just talk for 10 seconds and point and just inform you that Sindh, one of our subnational governments, has set the world record for the highest number of mangroves planted in a day. Over 1 million mangroves in our
Thank you.
coastal area.
Thank you for that information. We have had a very important and thought-provoking discussion on climate change, which is a very relevant and important topic. Many participants wanted to speak, but sorry we could not accommodate all of you due to the time constraint. I would like to conclude by saying that, as you all know, that Bangladesh is a country which is also prone to natural disaster and climate change owing to its hydrological and geomorphological realities, its location at the bottom of 3 major river systems, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra and the Meghna, GBM, and being bound on the south by the Bay of Bengal. It is ranked as the 6th most vulnerable country in the world. We are also taking measures, and Bangladesh was one of the first countries to establish the Climate Change Trust Fund with its own resources. As we come to an end of this session, it remains to be seen what we parliamentarians are doing to prevent the existential threat posed by climate change. Are we doing enough to fight the catastrophe of climate change? I would like to pose that question. And are we addressing the pertinent issues? Let us continue this conversation. Thank you all for this session and your presence, deliberation, comments, which has really contributed to this topic of climate change, and hopefully we will take it forward. Thank you all.
Excuse me. The round table of the speakers is in committee room 1. Good afternoon. We have now come to our closing session, and we are pleased to mention that we have a declaration that is agreed by all the participants. And without any further indulgence, I would ask our Secretary General, the Maldives Majlis Secretary General, to read the declaration, and that will conclude our closing session. Secretary General.
Thank you. Malay Declaration. We, Speakers of Parliament from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Pakistan and Sri Lanka, assembled in Malé, Maldives on 1st and 2nd September 2019 for the 4th South Asian Speakers Summit on Achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, organized jointly by the People's Majlis of the Maldives and the Interparliamentary Union, IPU. The summit built on the conclusions of our previous summits held in Bangladesh in 2016, India 2017 and Sri Lanka in 2018, and allowed us to continue to develop dialogue and parliamentary cooperation on achieving the SDGs. We welcome the active engagement of all participants as they shared their good practices and lessons learned, and we benefited from the rich contribution of parliamentarians, government representatives, United Nations experts, the IPU, research institutes, and civil society. We debated 3 issues of particular importance as our countries implement the SDGs. Number 1, promoting equality at work, including equal remuneration and creating jobs for young people. 2, nutrition and food security as drivers of maternal, child and adolescent health in the South Asian region. And 3, catalyzing the global agenda on climate change, overcoming challenges and using opportunities to strengthen the regional agenda for delivering on the Paris Agreement. We identified the following actionable and goal-oriented recommendations to advance parliamentary engagement with the SDGs in our respective countries. Number 1, we acknowledge that the SDGs provide a blueprint for a more sustainable future where no one is left behind. We commend the progress of our countries have made and applaud what they have completed so far in realizing the SDGs. They expect the momentum and good work to continue to make the SDGs a reality by 2030. According to available United Nations data, the region is not on track to achieve most of the goals of the 2030 agenda. We are therefore committed to strengthening the work of parliaments on SDG implementation and ensuring that they fully exercise all their functions in this regard. Number 2, parliaments play a crucial role in supporting implementation of the SDGs through their legislative, oversight, and budgetary functions. The SDGs are a unique opportunity to demonstrate our commitment to improving people's lives and the health of the planet. Parliaments enact legislation that support the implementation of their country's national sustainable development strategy. Parliaments apply an SDG lens to all their key parliamentary functions and define frameworks to periodically monitor government action. Parliamentary hearings, question times, and plenary reports should be used more effectively to oversee action and bring the SDGs to the attention of the public and the media, thereby encouraging accountability at all levels. Number 3, we acknowledge that parliaments should analyze their capacity to deliver on the SDGs at the earliest opportunity to make sure that their strategy is adequate, comprehensive, and effective. Such an assessment would allow our parliaments to design appropriate strategies and mechanisms for better engagement with the implementation of the SDGs. Number 4, combating inequalities and unequal remuneration should be a priority. Parliaments have a key role in addressing the social economic norms and factors that keep women out of the workforce. We acknowledge that there have been some advances, especially on gender parity in education. We commit to promoting within our parliaments action to ensure equality at work and equal pay so that our countries can continue to grow with the contribution of its women and men. We also commit to addressing the root causes of women's underrepresentation, in particular by strengthening gender equality in our laws and programs and by taking initiatives to enhance women participation in politics and in leadership positions. In particular, we commit to considering quota and other incentives to boost the political empowerment of women, including through access to parliament. Number 5, young people also face great challenges in accessing the labor market and decent work. Considering that young people represent a considerable portion of our society, Parliament should promulgate laws that place job creation and decent work at the center of national policy agendas. Laws and programs to help young people find jobs or to find training for future jobs are also crucial. We must invest in our young men and women by providing them with the opportunity to access the labor market, as well as funds and loans to help them bring their innovative ideas to life. Number 6, we acknowledge that malnutrition in all its forms is a major challenge for the South Asian region. Taken together, maternal and child undernutrition and child and adult overweight and non-communicable diseases affect a range of SDG goals and targets, including maternal and child mortality, educational attainment, and economic growth. We will ensure that this issue is placed high on the agenda of our parliaments and that relevant policies and legislative measures are taken. Number 7, we recognize that malnutrition has many antecedents, including the status of girls and women in our societies, poverty and food security, sanitation and public awareness about the importance of healthy diets and other nutrition practices such as physical activity. Tackling malnutrition effectively will require appropriate policies and legislation to address the many antecedents of malnutrition in our countries and across the region. We emphasize that efforts towards gender equality and women's and girls' empowerment offer great potential to accelerate progress on nutrition and health. Parliament should work to improve access to healthy foods and improve their availability and cost. Parliament should also highlight through various means a need for legislation to restrict marketing of unhealthy foods, to improve nutrition labeling, and to tax unhealthy foods and drinks. This would be a way to address maternal and child undernutrition as well as the high burden of non-communicable diseases in our region faces. We commit to using our parliamentary functions to scale up nutrition within health systems and to improve the flow of information to consumers about nutrition. We will also do our best to track progress on the implementation of SDG 2, Zero Hunger, and 3, Good Health and Well-being. Number 8, climate change affects our ability to achieve the SDGs, and countries in South Asia are among the most vulnerable in the world to the impacts of climate change. In particular, our region experiences severe flooding and landslides as a consequence of sea level rise and extreme rainfall. We also see extended periods of drought affecting rural areas and disproportionate increase in food insecurity among the poorest and most vulnerable. In South Asia, smog is also a major issue. We therefore reaffirm the need expressed at our previous summit in Colombo for an urgent reduction of global greenhouse gas emissions. We acknowledge that parliaments play a vital role in overseeing the effective national implementation of the Paris Agreement by ensuring that each country delivers on their nationally determined contributions. Furthermore, parliaments must use their budgetary and legislative powers to create an enabling environment, including through mechanisms for disaster risk and climate financing. In this direction, the summit calls upon the developed nations to abide by the principles enunciated in common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. As a first step, the summit expects them to honor their commitment to mobilize US $100 billion annually without any further delay. The summit also expects liberal contribution from the developed countries in Green Climate Fund, which has till now only been able to muster a contribution of US $10.3 billion. Number 9, we further acknowledge that many climate and disaster risks stretch across borders. We don't want to see the remaining tropical forests destroyed, and so we are committed to using technology. We therefore call for greater and urgent cooperation among the South Asian countries to strengthen the regional response to the challenges of climate change and to progress towards a more sustainable and climate resilient society that leaves no one behind and thus addresses the needs of the most vulnerable populations, including poor communities in rural, coastal, and flood-prone areas, drought-prone areas, Cha and Harur areas. We need to ensure that low-carbon development strategies are included in manifestos. The manifestos must ensure coral-friendly national infrastructure development plans, safeguarding reefs as well as people while building national prosperity and securing our long-term survival. Number 10, To inspire action on the SDGs, we will use all possible channels to bring the Mali Declaration to the attention of our colleagues and other relevant stakeholders. We pledge to continue our cooperation, strengthen our commitment, and share our experiences at the 5th South Asian Speakers Summit on achieving the SDGs. We thus revive the South Asia Speakers Forum on the SDGs to be chaired yearly by the host speaker of our summit, who will work with the IPU in monitoring the recommendations of the summit. In this direction, the summit exhorts the developed nations to abide by the principles enunciated in common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. As a first step, the summit expects them to honor their commitment for mobilizing US dollars. The summit number 11, the summit hoped that the IPU would continue to promote parliamentary engagement with the SDGs and continue to work with the United Nations and other relevant partners towards their successful implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary General. This 4th South Asian Speakers Summit of IPU members therefore resolve unanimously to adopt the Mali Declaration as narrated by the Secretary General of the Maldives Parliament. The declaration is adopted. This concludes the 4th Summit of the South Asian Speakers. Thank you. Well, we will now have lunch, and we also have a field trip at now 2 o'clock. But we have better modes of transport now.
एक मिनट मैं इस समिट के लिए आपको धन्यवाद दूंगा कि एक बेहतरीन मनोरम वातावरण में एक अच्छी हेल्थी डिस्कस के साथ ये समिट संपन्न हुई और मजलिस के अध्यक्ष जी को विशेष रूप से मैं धन्यवाद दूंगा कि उन्होंने सभी अतिथियों का बेहतरीन तरीके से आदर सत्कार किया और मैं सेक्रेटरी जनरल को भी थैंक्स करूंगा कि उन्होंने इस कॉन्फ्रेंस को सभी देशों की अमूल्य राय से एक बेहतरीन डिक्लेरेशन किया और सभी संसद सदस्यों को, यहाँ के राष्ट्रपति जी को और सभी जो अरेंजमेंट में लगे सभी कर्मचारियों को भी मैं भारत की तरफ से धन्यवाद करता हूँ।
I on behalf of all the speakers representing in this summit, would like to thank the Speaker of Honorable Speaker of Maldives, the Secretary General of IPU, and all the participants for organizing a successful conference. I would also like to extend my sincere thanks and my appreciation to the Honorable Majlis Speaker of Maldives, Dr. Shri Nasheed ji, for providing such good hospitality. And in this beautiful country, I hope we all agree that we have enjoyed not only the hospitality in this country, but also the deliberation taken place in this summit. And all the members, I also thank the Secretary General of the Maldives Majlis for providing all the assistance to the best and would look forward for further deliberation on this. Thank you very much. The President IPU also, the Honorable Speaker, has thanked that she has organized this conference. Thank you. जी